Hello everybody, today we're going to be thinking about Sonnet 116 by William Shakespeare, which is a poem that I think will be probably quite familiar to you. Might not immediately spring to mind because you might know what number it is in the sonnet sequence, but you probably will have heard this at a wedding or on a romantic TV show or something like that. So let's have a little read of it first, and then we're going to talk about how maybe this poem's a little bit more complicated than it might appear at first sight. So let's read it. Let me not the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. Okay, so what does the poem actually mean? Well, in a superficial sense, the first couple of lines mean that the poet doesn't want to put any barrier, any impediment in the way of the marriage of people who are genuinely in love. And this phrase, true minds, signals that we're talking here about emotional love, intellectual connection, as well as physical passion. Then the next bit, love is not love which alters, so which changes, when it alteration finds. So when it finds changes in the circumstances of the world around it, love doesn't change at all. Then, this is the first hint of something maybe a little bit different in the poem. Love doesn't change when the lover is unfaithful, the remover to remove. Love doesn't change if its love is removed from it. You know, if the other person in the relationship removes their affection, the original lover still loves them. So there seems to be a bit of a sensitivity here about faithfulness, about loyalty from the other person in the relationship. But then the speaker says, no, it is a fixed point. Love is eternal. It can't be changed by storms. Love is like a star to every travelling ship. And so the picture here is of the great sea voyages which were happening in the Renaissance period, where they were using stars as fixed navigation points. You know, if you consider the North Star, for example, looking at where the North Star was in relation to the other stars and so on would help you to know if you were sailing east or west, if you were going in the right direction. And although the star's value cannot be worked out, so whose worth's unknown, the value of this is unknown, we can measure its position in the sky. So this metaphor is telling us that maybe sometimes we don't value love, or we don't understand the value of love, but it's still a constant, it's still there. Then the third section here, the third quatrain, love doesn't change with time, even though physical beauty might come within reaching distance. So these rosy lips and cheeks, even if someone else more attractive comes along, love is going to remain loyal and it's not going to notice that. Again, we get another hint here of unfaithfulness, and this word bending pops up again in this section of the poem, this idea that maybe the other person in the relationship might stray. However, he goes back to the theme, love alters not, it doesn't change with short hours and weeks, but it remains the same until the end. The edge of doom is an apocalyptic picture of the end of the world. Then our final couplet, the speaker says if he's proved wrong in this, if this be error, if this be incorrect, and if I'm proved wrong, I'm going to take back everything that I've written, and nobody ever truly loved. So again, in these final lines, there's a real sense of uncertainty here. The poet says, if all of this is incorrect. So he's admitting the possibility that actually he might be wrong about love, and maybe love isn't actually what he says it is. So in terms of this particular sonnet, I think it's often taken out of context. As I've said, it's read a lot at weddings and things, and it's often taken out of context, and it's used in order to express this idea of constant, eternal love from both people in the relationship. But we need to realise, if we're analysing it, that it's actually part of an entire sonnet sequence. It's part of an extended narrative, and we need to understand the context of that. So Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets. that we have, and they were published as a sequence in 1609. And this tradition of writing a sequence of sonnets was established during the Renaissance period. And Shakespeare would have been aware of at least one example by the Italian sonneteer Petrarch. And if you read Petrarch's poetry, it's addressed to this beautiful woman who's unattainable. He can't reach her. She's never going to return his love, but he's desperately, desperately in love with her. And although Shakespeare's sonnets kind of play into this tradition, they also mark a departure from it as well. So instead of expressing this unrequited, eternal love for the perfect woman, he brings in a level of eroticism and lust which isn't found in Petrarch. And he also injects a new level of wit. So the poems are a little bit more enigmatic than perhaps the previous examples would have been. And one of the reasons for this is that sonnets 1 to 29 are addressed to a young man of high rank, and it's possible that sonnets 18 to 126 are also addressed to this figure, and he's called the fair youth, normally in criticism. So this is interesting because we normally expect a sonnet sequence to be written by a man and addressed to a woman. And Shakespeare's playing with the expectations here, and he's changing the approach to gender in some way. You know, is this a homosexual relationship that we're talking about? And if so, what would the perceptions of that have been at the time? What is the impact of that on how we read it today? Then sonnets 127 to 152 are addressed to the so-called dark lady. Now, it's not entirely clear whether this is to do with ethnicity or whether it's because she's got dark coloured hair, she's got black hair in the poems, but that's something worth thinking about as well. When you're writing about poetry, especially when you're doing your A-levels or if you're moving on to undergraduate study, you need to be reading around everything, all of the poets that you're studying, and you need to read literary criticism. So I'm looking at this section here by a critic called Hannah Crawforth, who wrote an introduction to Shakespeare's sonnets. It's available online on the British Library website. And so she says, we need to be careful about reading the poems autobiographically. So what she's saying here is that the poems are not from Shakespeare's perspective. There's a difference between Shakespeare and the speaker of the poems. And she continues, or seeing them as a key to the themes of love, jealousy, anger and lust that pervade Shakespeare's plays. The poetic persona, so not Shakespeare, the persona, the speaker, who speaks through the sequence is not Shakespeare himself. While many readers of the poems have traced a love triangle between the poet and two figures often called the young man and the dark lady, the sonnets themselves resist straightforward narrative. So they can't be easily interpreted in this way. The poems seem to play with the reader in this regard, tempting us with hints of the kind of love story that underpinned other popular poetic sequences of the time, or the plot of a Shakespearean comedy. At the same time, the poems constantly frustrate our attempts to trace the exact moment at which the poet loses or gains the affection of his lovers, or to map the precise relationship between the two enigmatic figures that so preoccupy his attentions. It is also significant that one of the lovers is male. Shakespeare's sonnets do not give us a predictably heterosexual romance, but rather a complex and intricate exploration of gender and sexuality that encourages ambiguity rather than resolution. So, as I've pointed out already, what we need to be really clear with is that even though a lot of the time these sonnets are seen as being quite transparent, you know, this is the voice of Shakespeare celebrating incredible love, actually it's a persona. And you should interpret this maybe as if it's one of Shakespeare's plays. These are different voices, perhaps, speaking through the poems. As well as that, the poems seem to play with the reader. And I think one of the problems is that Shakespeare's sonnets are often taken far too seriously, taken in quite an intense way. And actually what we need to recognise is that Shakespeare was an incredibly witty person, and he liked to play around with language and he liked to play with his audiences. So we need to recognise that as well when we're reading Sonnet 116. And then this final idea here is really interesting. So there's an exploration of gender and sexuality that encourages ambiguity. So this idea of ambiguity, there being multiple interpretations of the poems, there not being any fixed resolution. You know, for example, why is the first section of the sequence addressed to a man and the second section addressed to a woman. You know, does that undermine this idea that love is eternal and that you shouldn't be unfaithful? And what are the implications of the male figure in the first section of the text? So lots of things to think about there. Let's go back to the poem, and I want to make sure that you know about the structure of the Shakespearean sonnet. There are different types of sonnets. There's the Petrarchan sonnet, I've already mentioned Petrarch, and then there's this one which we call the Shakespearean sonnet. So if we look at the rhyme scheme, it's probably the most striking thing about the Shakespearean sonnet. We have AB, AB, so minds rhymes with finds, love with remove, and then CD, CD, so mark, bark, shaken and taken, EF, EF, cheeks, weeks, come and doom, and GG, proved and loved. And something that I should say here is that it looks like there's half rhymes in the poem, but you need to remember that pronunciation has changed over time. So actually, the way these words were pronounced in the Renaissance period, it would have been full rhyme. You'll notice as well that the poem ends with a concluding couplet. So we have this full rhyme at the end, this GG rhyme at the end, and this gives a real, or supposed to give a real sense of conclusion and finality to the poem. And that concluding couplet kind of summarises what's gone before, and gives it a sense of an ending. As well as this, we need to pay attention to the rhythm. And the rhythm for sonnets is usually iambic pentameter. And lots of people talk about this as being like the rhythm of the heartbeat, you know, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. So there's 10 syllables per line. So if you count the syllables in the first line, let me not to the marriage of true minds, we've got 10 syllables there. And these are grouped into 5 pairs of unstressed and then stressed metrical feet. So feet is just the word for a group of syllables. So admit, impediments. If you look at where I've put the syllables in bold there, that's where you would stress the words when you're reading it. And we can see admit is a metrical foot. It's got the unstressed syllable first, ad, and then the stressed syllable mit. And as you read the poem, you probably won't be conscious of this, but you will be falling into the rhythm of iambic pentameter. Now, one thing that's really interesting to do with poetry is to look at where poets deviate from this particular rhythm. So, for example, this second line, how do you read it? Love is not love. Love is not love. Where do you put that emphasis? So think about the rhythm as being maybe a kind of loose guideline to maybe like a bass line in a song. You know, you've got the rhythm of the drum going along, but then on top of that, you have the guitar riffs that are playing along with that. And ask yourself, when does the poet deviate from that rhythm, and why does he do it, and why would he change it and put stresses on particular words instead of other words? Okay, so moving on into the language then. This first phrase, the marriage of true minds, suggests a real equality of the lovers. So it doesn't really matter what the gender is. There's a sense that they're both equal in this relationship. But is this love physical, or is it platonic love? You know, this emphasis on true minds could be suggesting that it's platonic love. So there's a lot of questions here arising about gender and the nature of the relationship between these two men. Then we've got a lot of repetition in this first quatrain. So we've got love repeated, alters, remover to remove. And Shakespeare's playing with the meanings of these words. And he's thinking to himself, when does a word assume its true meaning? So when does I love you really mean I love you? And when does it mean I'm infatuated by you? You know, and what does love actually mean? So think really about why Shakespeare is repeating these words and what the significance of that is. Then if we look here, Shakespeare's injecting a sense of difficulty into the relationship. So let me, not to the marriage of true minds, admit impediments. So the speaker is not going to create a barrier in the relationship. But does that mean that someone else is putting a barrier into that relationship? Is ideal love actually possible in the cold, hard light of day? Is it possible for these people to really love each other? And again, you could think about the gender context of that as well. And if we look a little bit further down, despite the suggestion that there's impediments, this speaker is insisting that genuine love is stable, strong and steady. So we have this semantic field of stability. So ever fixed, never shaken, it's a star, love alters not. We've got this real sense of the speaker's stability in love. But alongside that, we've got this constant anxiety that the person that he loves is maybe not going to be as faithful as he is. So look at all the negatives in the poem. We've got not, no, never, not, and not. And adapting a phrase from one of Shakespeare's plays, does the speaker protest too much? You know, he's constantly saying what love is not, rather than focusing just on what love is. And why would he be saying what love isn't? Is that because he's experienced bad relationships in the past? Is that because he's worried about the faithfulness of the person that he's talking to here? So actually, whilst this poem does ostensibly, superficially celebrate romantic love, it's also hinting at the insecurities around love as well. And if we look back in the sequence, the sonnet 115, I put that on the screen there, the speaker refers to time's tyranny and he refers to doubting. So in the sonnet immediately preceding this one, there's again a real sense of doubt and insecurity in the relationship. So maybe he's saying that this ideal of love, this is what love could be, but actually in reality, maybe we can never achieve that. And then if we look at the final couplet as well, this kind of encapsulates what I'm saying. And the couplet often summarises what's gone before in the poem. And so that conditional if, so if this be error, if this is wrong, so the poet's admitting, or the speaker's admitting here, a sense of doubt that has kind of been encroaching on the edge of our consciousness. It's been hovering in the background of the poem all the way through. And then it culminates in this word if I'm wrong. And what are the consequences of that? What if the speaker is wrong in his choice of who he's loved? Or what if the speaker's wrong in his understanding of what love means? Well, what are the consequences of that? You know, and then he says, well, I'm going to have to take back everything that I've written, and I'm going to have to say that nobody ever truly loved. And this is potentially a cataclysmic realization, isn't it? If the speaker is pinning his whole existence on loving the other person, and if he finds out that he's wrong, then he's going to lose everything, isn't he? So actually, this poem is also about trust, isn't it? And how you can trust another person. Can we ever trust other people? So it's a lot more questioning and tentative, perhaps, than maybe some readings of it would suggest. And there's lots of questions that I think you should ask yourself when you're reading Shakespeare's sonnets. So I haven't particularly talked about literary theory in this video, but if you wanted to start thinking about feminism or representations of masculinity as well, ask yourself, how does the speaker represent gender and the relationships between the different genders? So is it significant that sonnets 1 to 126 are addressed to the fair youth? Is the gender of the addressee important here, and why is that? How does the speaker represent the dark lady in the subsequent sonnets? Does he uphold gender stereotypes, or does he challenge them? Does he challenge them enough? What does that look like? And then for each sonnet you look at, remember to consider its place within the overall narrative. You know, these sonnets are not individual poems to be taken out of context and studied in and of themselves. They're part almost of a novel. If you think of the sonnet sequence like a novel and realise that you've got to look at that sonnet embedded within the rest of the narrative, that'll be quite helpful for you. So what goes before, what goes after the sonnet that might prompt you to question its superficial meaning. In terms of doing a little bit of wider reading there, ShakespeareOnline.com is a brilliant resource, and there's lots of essays on there. Have a look and a good explore of that. I'm always pointing you to the British Library, but again, that's a really, really helpful resource, and it's got some essays there on Shakespeare's sonnets and of course on the rest of Shakespeare's works. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you check out the rest of the videos on the playlist.